Chapter 6 Shipwreck. The warning that we were nearing a rapid was readily recognizable. Before we entered the area of the accelerated current, the surface of the water, when seen from a distance, showed gentle ripples running contrary to the river's course. Immediately afterwards we caught the sound of a dull purring, which seconds later became a thunderous rumble. Such signs never failed to dismay me. The first question I asked myself on waking up in the morning, before beginning another stage of our journey, was, I wonder whether we'll have another rapid today. As the person responsible for the expedition, I found this preoccupation was becoming almost an obsession. The strain would have sapped my energies if constant work had not kept my mind alert. 2 more rapids were yet to be added to the obstacles we had to face in the river of the dead. Everything was going along normally. The sun had increased in power until it became a furnace. The canoe sped along as if on wings, in a straight line past the 1,000 monotonously identical curves. I attributed the rapidity of the waters to a stream which flowed into them, and as this stream entered the river in the vicinity of one of the bends, I calculated that, after navigating beyond it, I should find that the thrust of the current would cease. It all happened in a flash, at the very moment that the panorama broadened. I heard the thunder of a rapid. I had a fleeting vision of watery vapor dispersing in tiny rainbows, rocks with their angles flattened and worn smooth, and bubbling spume that seemed to engulf everything around it. If I was caught unawares, these savants were rendered motionless by the unexpectedness of it. They could not row, but sat there absorbed by the contemplation of a huge tree trunk lying among the rocks. They shouted to me, "Wede, wede, peepadi, tree, dangerous." It was more than dangerous. There was going to be a catastrophe if I could not elude the obstacle. I had no choice. If I did not miss the tree, we would be smashed to pieces. If I wasted precious seconds in trying to make towards the shore, we might still crash into the tree trunk. I had to go past it and take the chance of negotiating the rapids. I shouted at the top of my voice to Norma to be ready for anything, and I manipulated the oar with all my strength. We passed so close to the tree that we had to duck our heads to avoid being struck by the branches. The canoe took the center of the current and rushed on like a lathered toboggan. At every second I felt sure we could not keep the prow up and we would overturn. We sped through a shower of spray. Fortunately, the Indians did not attempt to use their oars. Norma had the courage to smile at me, an action for which I am still grateful, and which made a lump come to my throat. Without our either impending or assisting it, the craft took the best course, a sort of channel beside the gleaming rocks that served as a natural dam. Our speed slackened a little. I began to breathe more freely, when all at once I was hurled from my seat and pitched headlong into the water. In a fraction of a second the canoe was sinking, and the bales and boxes were floating about in the turbulent waters. As I scrambled to my feet, I grabbed the carbine and 2 knapsacks and climbed back into the canoe. Norma had turned a complete somersault underneath the craft, and by a fraction of an inch had missed striking against the submerged tree trunk that had been the cause of the wreck. Spluttering, and breathing hard, she assured me she was all right. In each hand she was holding on to a large bag. Ureta came up to us grinning. He too had salvaged some of the material. Fabre was swimming after 2 cases. We brought all these things to the bank with great effort and went to fetch the rest. The force of the current made us plunge and stumble on the slippery rocks on the river bed. When the devilish current dragged us, any attempts to withstand it were useless. We had to let it carry us and use our hands and feet and as shock absorbers as we were bumped against the rocks. The water course buffeted against a rock bend, forming a whirlpool which hurled us against the bank. There we rested a moment before continuing back along the bank to the site of the wreck and plunging into the river again in search of equipment, possibly owing to the midday sun and the fact that the water came up only to our waist. We recovered almost everything, even plates, cutlery, and lamps. Among the important things whose loss we were to lament were bags of rice and beans, a case of powdered milk, another of rationed foodstuffs, cases of ammunition, and a bag containing personal belongings, including our engagement and wedding rings, which we had taken off because of the blisters on our hands caused by rowing. The savants stopped smiling when they found that the river had claimed the ball of Eurocum, most of their flashy new arrows, as well as some of the delicately woven palm fiber baskets called baumerie, containing small coconuts, which they were taking as gifts for their brothers of the parent tribe. In the salvage operations, I worked by reflex action. The reality of disaster robbed me of willpower. I feared for the rolls of film and the signed cameras. My hand shaking with nervous anxiety, I pressed the catches of the hermetically sealed aluminum cases. There was not a drop of water on the paper in which the films were wrapped. Then feverishly I took the camera out of their cases. One was undamaged, the other, which we kept always at hand for filming anything of importance that occurred, was dripping wet, so the film in it, of course, was ruined. The apparatus, however, still worked. Gradually, the dismay caused by the disaster began to be forgotten, but now, in a sunless place, we were stiff with cold. My wife began to shiver, and I involuntarily to do the same. The hours I had spent diving and wading in the river were having their effect. We recovered somewhat with doses of brandy, which was reserved for medicinal purposes. To rest, we supported ourselves on the sloping high bank of the river, with our feet in the water. When we tried to change our position, we slid and slithered in the mud. The appearance we presented could hardly have been more pitiful. The warriors reclined on some roots. They were taciturn and sullen. They did not do their hair or rearrange their adornments. This was a bad sign. Their savant pride had suffered a rude blow. In the parent village there were many famous captains who would observe their arrival, and it would be the greatest affront to appear unadorned with fresh paint, fail to exhibit beautiful arrows, or to dispense the little baskets of tender coconuts. I appreciated their point of view and did not insist upon their helping me. Any imprudence on my part might result in their abandoning us. Such an idea, I think, had more than once passed through their minds. I emptied the water out of the canoe by tipping it violently from stern to stern. Then I started to reload it. My troubles were not yet over. We still had to wade past the rapid because that was the only way to reach the other side and get some sun. It was sheer irony that the sun, which earlier that day had seemed such a nuisance, was now a vital necessity. While Norma held the prow steady, I stowed in the canoe the bales and boxes dripping with water. As I went to pick up the medicine chest, which was now bedaubed with the colors of various medicaments, Eureka handed it to me. I smiled at him gratefully, but he remained straight-faced. Shortly afterwards, Fabre helped us too. When everything was ready for us to face the whirlpool, we noticed that the oars were missing. We spent a long time looking for them. At last, Eureka came back with one of them, and one arrow. Farther ahead, the water was deep and the current stronger. With only a single oar to negotiate it, it felt helpless. I hesitated until the last moment, We tested the canoe. I imagined that I had endured the worst of shocks already, but it was not so. The craft now absolutely staggered me because the packages and blankets were soaking wet. No sooner were we all embarked than the gunwale of the vessel was less than 1 inch above the water. One false move, one sudden swerve to avoid a boulder, and it would well and truly be the end of the expedition, for there would be no chance of recovering anything in deep waters. I believe that decision to carry on as we were was one of the most momentous and painful I have ever had to make. My wife guessed the way my mind was working, or perhaps the expression on my face told her, for she smiled reassuringly. I commented to the savants, "Og pi padi, dangerous water." Ureta replied tersely, "Tau, let's go." I made as if to straighten out the tarpaulin and gave Norma's hand a squeeze. I pushed off gently, and although I am no practicing Christian, I did put my trust in the Almighty. Any hopes I had that the canoe would behave delicately were promptly dissipated. It took to the current with such abruptness that water came in over one side, and refusing to respond to the efforts of my solitary oar, bore straight for the center of the whirlpool. As if our dreadful odyssey were about to repeat itself, I shouted to Norma not to make any attempt to grab anything this time, but to swim like hell for the shore so as not to get mixed up with the terrifying vortex of that whirlpool. The canoe tilted capriciously, and more water poured in. Then, grazing the very eddies of the whirlpool, we rushed on our way, on and into tranquil waters. Our own momentum drove us straight into a shoal of sand. We stayed there for a moment, paralyzed, my wife and I, under the impact of sheer anxiety. Fabre and Ureta, because if they moved, the canoe would be flooded. I could not ascertain whether there was even a fraction of an inch of our boat above the water level because I dared not look. The banks of the River of the Dead are inhospitable. They are characterized by the compact mass of thorny bushes and shrubs, by the steep cliffs that rise sharply out of the river, and by the illusory fringe of sand which here and there narrowly frames the soily slopes left by the waters as they recede. It was upon one of these sandy strips that we had run aground, but there were masses of roots to make it difficult to get about. The net losses occasioned by our capsizing were not inconsiderable. We could no longer count on some of the foodstuffs which had formed our staple diet. My wife had cut her calf badly, and I had many bruises and lacerations on my legs and feet. We were riddled with mosquito bites, and the confounded insects set to work on us again before we had time to sort out and dry off the most necessary items of our equipment. With her characteristic solicitude and savoir-faire, Norma concentrated upon a search for eatables in a fit condition for cooking, for we had not yet had lunch. Ureta gathered firewood and made a fire, and Fabre devoted himself to fishing, or rather to wasting fishing lines and hooks. Owing to the voracity of the fishes and his incompetence as an angler, the things most urgently needed we spread out to dry in the sun, cursing the roots which constantly tripped us up. I set to work to dismantle the firearms, to oil and grease them and get them ready for use. There were more tracks of large carnivores than anywhere else we had been. There was no doubt we had camped in a watering place for jaguars. The great weariness that we all felt did not allow us to waste our energies in changing our campsite. The heat of the sun was now oppressive. Shirtless, I sweated copiously. I was just finishing drying the camera, from which I almost expected to see a fish jump out, when Norma called me to come eat. Her work had been exhausting in the interval while she had been preparing our food. She had been busy sorting out and arranging all the material. I had been so occupied with the sign camera and the firearms, I had not realized how much she was doing. Ureta and Fabre looked miserably and at the almost meatless meal. Fabre had used 6 complete lines and hooks and caught 1 small fish. A tin of sausages and some spaghetti had to satisfy the inner man. Norma and I accepted the fare without protest, for a most tiring morning had robbed us of our appetites. Not so the savants. However, we ate with visible indications of disgust. When the sun was hidden, we finished setting up camp on the high bank. The blankets and covers still wringing wet, we placed around the fire. We left the other articles in our equipment strewn for the moment on the bank, having removed them from the canoe before the short twilight fell. Suddenly Ureta stood tense, like the taut string of a bent bow. Anxiously I followed the direction of his extended arm, for when a savant assumes such a rigid attitude, the most unforeseeable thing may be about to happen. A large jaguar, half hidden by a withered tree trunk, was about to drink. Indifferent to the equipment, the canoe, and our campfire, I confess that I am no hunter. Blood sports do not attract me, and I even condemn those who kill animals without a valid reason. Ureta urged me in a whisper. Tiaba, arrow hunt, which I interpreted to mean you shoot arrow bullet and hunt it. Without further ado, I raised my carbine and fired. The animal fell as if struck by lightning, but in an unnatural position, half curled up, and with its mouth still in the water. Ureta took a few steps toward it, with his bow at the ready, and then loosed an arrow which entered the jaguar's eye. Then, in great excitement, he seized his spear, and in 4 triumphant leaps was at the animal's side. He delivered a violent thrust at the animal's head. Grinning at me on finding the beast well and truly dead, he exclaimed, "Abba Pashidi, good hunting," and was about to spear it in the abdomen. I restrained him because I wanted the pelt. We hung the jaguar on a rough cross and skinned it, not very expertly, I dare say, by the inadequate light of a flickering fire. We tied the fine pelt, which measured over 7 feet from nose to tail, to 4 boulders and constructed a rough shelter of branches and leaves over it so that the humidity of the night air should not wet it too much. The incident, far from tiring me, had given me fresh vigor. I did not feel any effect of the wearying toil until I lay down to sleep. That night the Indians' good humor returned. They roasted a goodly part of the jaguar by the fire. The meat, although sinewy and somewhat acid to the taste, satisfied the savants' needs apart from the fact that they have a liking for it. In the morning we had carried out our usual meticulous inspection in search of the tiny ticks that pestered us, and I was nailing some pieces of board to some long poles, to serve as makeshift oars, when the indifference of the Indians to the preparations we were making for the recommencement of the voyage became obvious. It was Ureta who expressed what they were thinking. Looking down at his feet, as if ashamed of himself, he told me that they were going to return to their village. He did not ask my permission or suggest any reason why they wished to go back. As savant warriors, they stated their intention frankly. I knew very well what had got into them. Sounding indifferent, I said he was quite right, and I added, hazardously, that if I, in their place, were to see myself deprived of Uricum and without new arrows, I would do the same. Up to now, Ureta had never shown surprise at anything, not even at the power of my carbine, but my answer surely did surprise him. When I realized that he had grasped my meaning, I added that, after all, just as at home in their village, so here in the jungle there existed the same conditions for providing themselves with new equipment. He clicked his tongue and went off to confer with Fabre. When he came back, he looked me in the face as if relieved that now he would not have to do something which he really did not wish to do. He informed me that they would make new arrows and baskets and would obtain new coconuts. As for the suricum, the processing of it took a long time. He added that the warriors of the parent tribe would not show them due respect if they arrived muddy as a result of the long trek. With much gravity I praised their loyalty as valiant warriors and presented them with knives and combs. The latter invariably lasted only 2 days or so, because of the hard use they were put to in combing their long, tough hair. That same evening we saw the last vestiges of the jaguar disappear in the waters of the river, including the bloodstains on the sand. It was very probable that the feline had a female companion which might come looking for him, hence we thought it prudent to remove ourselves, and we set up camp on a beautiful little island almost in mid-river. We remained in our new camp for 5 days, spending much of the time hunting and fishing. Meanwhile the savants gathered the stout reeds to make new arrows and went off on expeditions in search of young coconuts, which task took them away for the greater part of the day. The palm fiber with which they plaited the baskets was to be found in abundance in the area, but not the coconuts, which, for some reason or other, proved difficult to come by. We, for our part, took advantage of the pause to have a good rest and recuperate our energies. We made a thick mattress of palm leaves in true Indian fashion, and we found it gave excellent results. The rest allowed my painful muscles to recover somewhat from the long hours of sitting in a strained position and from the exhausting labor of rowing under a merciless sun in a temperature reading of 122 Fahrenheit. In this tranquil lull we were refreshed for what lay before us. Ureta and Fabre selected armfuls of bamboo cane, takuara, which they cut and shaped as arrows. Their bronze-colored bodies gleaming with sweat, they worked and looked again with a critical eye at the slim shafts they were fashioning. Any arrow which revealed even a slight curvature was rejected, for there was no time to waste in straightening it by the heat of the fire. Those they retained were tapered and polished at the point by rubbing with a very rough leaf and afterwards finishing off with a finer one. They obtained parrot's feathers, and with a fine thread made from invira they were tied on with consummate delicacy, to be knotted firmly when once the savants were thoroughly satisfied. To make the feathers perfectly uniform, they used a stick heated in the fire to singe off all the projecting points. In the arid weather, the ticks teeming in the neighborhood of the river, they not only swarmed on the ground, but clung in bunches to the roots of shrubs, lying in wait for some new victim on whom to satiate their thirst for blood. As a result of the inroads made upon us by gadflies, mosquitoes, and smaller flies in general, our skin did not show the smaller bites of these mites. Often, if I rubbed my hand over my shoulders or my chest, I came up against what seemed to be a kind of small wart. It was not a wart, but a tick feasting upon my blood. Revolted, I got rid of the thing by applying a hot ember to it. This treatment was not intended to burn the tick so much as to make it remove its head from my flesh. The wounds I was left with took a long time to heal. Experience derived from previous explorations had taught me to take the greatest care not to get my flesh torn or cut, but the capsizing of the canoe by the rapid gave us numerous lacerations. The injuries themselves were trivial enough, but our bodies had still not become inured to the rigors of the Mato Grosso climate, and we had paid too little attention to our hurts. Since the loss of our iron rations, we lacked what was essential to maintain ourselves in robust health. The injuries to our shins and calves became purulent ulcers, very painful and a confounded nuisance, for they were in continual contact with natural hazards. The whole gamut of antibiotics in our medicine chest proved impotent to heal them. At the end of the 5th day of our enforced rest, the savants were satisfied. They now had a score of new arrows apiece, and several little baskets filled with a goodly quantity of young coconuts. Hunting for food had now become a sheer necessity, for upon it depended the question of whether we should go hungry or not. For the first few days our voyage continued without pressing anxieties beyond food. Herds of young wild pigs and the pace-spotted cavy, a rodent mammal, abounded hereabouts. Often we passed so close to them that we could clearly hear the dull grunting sounds they made as they browsed near the water's edge. It was one thing to see them, and quite another to catch them. However, when we spotted them, we were almost upon them, and the work of pulling in to the side took up some time. When we leapt ashore, we were a dozen yards or so from the familiar obstacle, the impenetrable jungle. The cracking of a branch, or the wind blowing towards them, was enough to scare them away. As we could not use the machetes, we had to creep through the decaying vegetation, still muddy from the rains, handicapped by thorny brambles and sticky spiders' webs and creepers called cat's claws, unas de gato, which I had to pull off my clothing one by one so that they should not tear it. When we reached the spot where they had been, the herd had vanished. I had a hard job to restrain the savants, who, after examining the grass and the broken bushes, wanted to continue the chase. They forgot that we were traveling by river and not through the jungle. To have let them follow their natural inclinations would have been to risk not seeing them again for hours or for days. Their hunter's code would not have allowed them to give up the pursuit once they had embarked upon it. I tried to trust in the possibility that our fortunes would change for the better, but the savants did not share this point of view. Their existence was one long fight against hunger, and they could not see why we should continue our journey instead of camping until we had obtained supplies of meat. My dread was that, by agreeing to please them, we might be bogged down by indefinite delays. There existed between us the great gulf of difference between the civilized man and the savage, and of the two I was the one who was in the wrong. They never really asked me to stop and hunt. They would have rode on until they fainted with hunger. They were warriors, they knew what hunger was, and they were accustomed to it and could endure it. But during these days the incipient comradeship which had been manifesting itself disappeared. Sullenness replaced it, and became more marked from day to day, as they came back from hunting trips with some minor prey insufficient to feed us all. I must point out, however, that they never attempted to conceal what they had brought or ate it in the jungle. I foresaw that at any moment we should glimpse the hunting grounds where the parent village was situated, and there assuredly the natives would provide themselves with meat. I refused to waste a single day. Every time I asked them whether the parent tribe was nearby, the Indians gave me the same answer: "Rap tu Redi," very near. Then one day we found ourselves confronted by another rapid. Without more ado, we made camp and prepared to hunt. To attempt to negotiate it with the little goodwill the natives were displaying would have been too risky. We set out at dawn. Salre and Ureta were wreathed in warm smiles of satisfaction. Their sullenness evaporated like the banks of dark clouds against the riverside cliffs when the brilliant sun flooded them with new warmth. However, when I urged Norma to go with us because of the risk involving in staying behind alone in the jungle, she preferred to remain. for she was afraid they would consider her an encumbrance. Not a little uneasy in my mind, I left her a rifle ready for use, remembering what the Sultaneras say in the Mato Grosso. The only law which is respected is the law of the 45, the 45 caliber revolver. My last injunction to her was to shoot first and ask questions afterwards. Then I set off behind the Indians, who were looking at me impatiently. We did not carry machetes, which would have given warning of our approach at a distance of half a mile. As we had to traverse tangled underbrush, I replaced the explorer's hat I usually wore with a dark handkerchief tied round my head. The cuts on my feet prevented me wearing boots, and the slippers I now wore seemed ideal for stealthy jungle trekking. The savants sniffed the frigid air, and like bloodhounds set off unhesitatingly through the forest. They bowed, swayed, swerved, and doubled themselves up with incredible harmony and speed. They made no sound. It seemed as if their feet had wings. They stepped on branches without breaking them, and skirted brakes and coppices without slackening speed or injuring themselves at all. They were now in their element. I felt a stranger, clumsy and unskilled. I got hooked up on every overhanging twig and tore and scratched my flesh on thorns. Although I kept my eyes steadfastly on where I was going, I was not used to marching in a crouching posture amid a labyrinth of virgin jungle. The minutes became an hour, a long, long hour. The panorama was unchanged, sparse, thin trees among thorn bushes, in a sea of sun and shadow. The rapidity of the savants' progress did not diminish. They stopped and waited for me countless times whenever this happened. Salre looked at me sardonically, but as far as Ureta was concerned, I might not have been there. My shirt was glued to my body with perspiration, and I could do nothing against the penetrating mosquitoes. My body rebelled against the cramped position, my ideal slippers, and my socks. Soaked by the soggy ground, imprisoned feet frozen and lacerated by thorns which easily pierced the jute soles. There was not a moment of respite, not the briefest breathing spell. The savants hunted for a living. What a difference between that and hunting as a sport. Rotted tree trunks were everywhere. We did not need to go round them, as the trunks were of no great girth, but we, the Indians, as well as myself, passed by them with the greatest caution. A scorpion, a snake, or a poisonous spider might be lurking behind them to spring some treacherous surprise upon us. We must have been going for 2 hours or more when my senses dulled, now from the strain of the forced march and the effort not to create difficulties for the savants, became alerted. Salre and Ureta had their bows in position to shoot. A thicket lay between us and a small herd of some 15 wild pigs. Males, females, and young ones were rooting for food. The warriors considered that it was my show. They dared not trust to their arrows, which they had made of bamboo cane. For this kind of game they used special arrows made of hard wood, and these had been lost in the wreck. I swallowed hard, but not saliva, because I didn't have any left. My mouth was bone dry. The shot should have been as easy as falling off a log, but as I raised my gun, my hand was shaking like an aspen leaf. The savants put absolute trust in firearms and were confidently waiting. I wiped away the sweat that was blurring my vision, and holding my breath, I squeezed the trigger. A click was all that happened. The detonator had struck a dud cartridge. A slight noise caused the herd to stop eating. The young ones snuggled up to their mothers, and the male hogs grunted. To open the breech and expel the cartridge would be to invite the animals to flee. I groped at my holster, drew my revolver, and took careful aim at one of the male hogs. As I fired, the detonation caused a stampede. Amid squeaks and grunts and the snapping of branches, the herd fled in disorder. The Indian's glance of reproach was of only a second's duration, but none the less distasteful. The male had decamped with the rest, but a trail of blood showed that he was mortally wounded. Ureta and Salre took to their heels in pursuit. ignoring the thorns and the tangled vegetation. The blood trail guided us. The mad chase must have gone on for 20 minutes. Finally, before I caught up with them, I heard the whistling of 2 arrows and the snort of the wild hog. The animal lay dead with the arrows plunged into its heart. My shot had been high, but anyway, it had been effective enough to slow the animal down so that the Indians could get within range. The wild pig must have weighed at least 90 pounds. Fabre and Ureta carried the carcass, without pausing for breath, back to camp, taking turns and bearing it on their shoulders. Recriminations were forgotten in light of comforting reality. The campfire was soon shedding its welcome warmth and sending forth the aroma of roast pig. Here we were on the very threshold of Neolithic life, basking in the warm glow of the gladness of warriors, with meat to fill their bellies once again. We ate a good half of the animal for lunch. By nightfall nothing would have remained but the well-picked bones, if my wife's prudent parsimony had not sneaked a shoulder away for the following day. How these savants had built up their strength again! Their abdomens were distended and as taut as the skin of a new drum.